reform, development, and financing. As we all know, the Asia-Pacific region experiences increased frequency and severity from the adverse impacts of disaster risks. And some of those are further exacerbated by climate change effects, which continues to affect this particular region. And it's also important to underscore the fact that the Asia-Pacific region is amongst one of the regions globally that is very prone to the adverse impacts of climate change and disaster risks. Today, I am pleased to have here in front, and also one of the panelists is joining online, a very distinguished panelist that I would introduce shortly. But firstly, allow me just to highlight the goal of the session this evening. And the key goal and the outcome that we're expecting is that this session would emphasize the critical role that data plays in shaping disaster risk reduction policies. It is also equally important that today we will explore how we can establish global data standards and ensure consistency across regions and institutions, ensuring better coordination and more effective resource allocation. A key aspect of today's discussion will also focus on how data can be used to perform cost-benefit analysis, particularly in regions facing fiscal constraints. And that holds true for our small island developing states and our least developing countries in the Asia-Pacific region. Finally, we will discuss how disaster risk data can be integrated into policy frameworks at both the national and local levels. And by embedding data into policy-making processes, we can ensure that resilience building efforts are informed, effective, and scalable. At the end of the session today, I hope from the interventions that the panelists will offer to us today, we would be able to draw out some key messages and actionable strategies that we could consider progressing forward as respective stakeholders, partners, and governments that are here amongst us within this room. Ladies and gentlemen, the format of our session this evening, I would offer 2 rounds of questions to the panel members. Following that, we would allow 1 to 2 questions from the audience before we summarize the session. Before proceeding further, ladies and gentlemen, let me now introduce the panelists. First on my left is Ms. Vidushi Yana. Vidushi Yana is the Chief Operating Officer of the National Emergency Management Agency in Australia. Further in the middle is Dr. Satoru Nishikawa. Dr. Nishikawa is a professor at the Tohoku University and also JICA Senior Advisor. We have joining us online today Mr. Daniel McGree, who works as a Senior Actuary Consultant with the World Bank. And further to my left, Ms. Christine Zimmer, who is the Technical Director, Watershed Risk Management and CVC Lead, Credit Valley Conservation in Canada. And far end is Mr. Chad Michael Briggs, who is a Professor, Academic Program Director, Executive Masters in Disaster Risk and Crisis Management with AIM. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe you would agree with me that we have a very distinguished panel. And as you may have seen on the screen, my name is Exley Taloiburi. It's a privilege to be given this opportunity to moderate this important session. I work at the Pacific Community based in Fiji, supporting 27 member countries, and I oversee SPC's disaster risk management work in the region. Let me now turn our attention to the panel members and start off with the first question, which I will direct to Ms. Yana. Ms. Yana, what are some of the data challenges you've encountered in balancing immediate disaster recovery and long-term preventive investments? How has the lack of standardized data impacted your ability to plan for both immediate recovery and the prevention of future disasters? You have 3 minutes, Madam.
Oh, lovely. I feel like, I'm in Senate estimates. Good evening, everybody, and it is a pleasure to be on this panel. I hope all of you have been enjoying the forum. The conference is really a rich source of information. I've certainly learnt a lot over the last couple of days. What I've, in essence, learned is that data is the key for all of us here, and that should not be a surprise. We've needed data for as long as we've known. Even in our current, day-to-day life, we need data. So it is no different that we need data for risk reduction and prevention. So for us in NEMA, we look after end-to-end emergency management capability. And for each area of our recovery efforts, we actually really need rich source of data. Why do we need rich source of data? Because it allows us to actually identify where all the risks are, and then it allows us to actually target any investments and actually build capability. So for example, a few years ago, before even NEMA was established, we realised that there's a high-risk weather season in Australia between October to April. And we did not have a preparedness program. But over the course of a few years, we collected that data, and we realised if we brought all the community together, had a combined and a shared understanding of what data and what the outlook of the season looks like for Australia, it allowed our states and territories and local governments to prepare better. So that data was really, really important for us. Equally, we were then able to build capability in NEMA, where we were able to plan to actually help our nation prepare for any disasters or the season that was upcoming. Additionally, I think decision-making for us is also to work with communities and understand where the key risks are when the aftermath of a disaster event hits. So for us, it's important to know, what efforts and what resources are required with the after effect, whether it's for 50 people, 500 people, or 5,000 people, and each element of that investment can be very, very, very different proposition, like all of you would probably be aware. So for us, like everybody else, data is key to any investment and decision making. The challenges that we find with data is that it's not consistent across. So we are like every other country, where we've got national data, we've got state data, we've got local data. So to bring it all together is always a challenge. It also looks at the cost of data, because a lot of private industries now are providing that rich data, but not everybody can afford that data. So that's a bit of a challenge. And then sharing is not easy. That would be quite, and I've been hearing that from a lot of our colleagues across all over the country, that sharing remains a bit of a challenge. And then so how do you actually standardise and share the same information with everybody is something that we grapple with, but we are trying to, through NEMA and through our state partner agencies, to actually work through what might that look like. And so I wanted to actually share that over a period of time, Australia's climate obviously keeps changing. We have seen, flash floodings and unique environment that we haven't seen before. So that requires us to be better prepared in collecting that data so that we can learn from the lessons and the current events and be prepared better for the future.
Thank you very much, Ms. Yana. And as we have heard, further reaffirmation of the importance of data, but also key challenges in regards to affordability, coordination, and data sharing. Those are critical issues that's worth noting. Let me now turn our attention to Professor Nishikawa. Professor, with your extensive experience in both the Japanese government and international organizations, how do you see the role of data integration in shaping national DRR strategies? What challenges have you observed when trying to standardize data across international platforms to support risk-informed decision-making at both the local and global levels? You have 3 minutes, Professor.
Thank you for this opportunity. And I'd like to point out first, there is a need for interoperability of data because, let's take an example. There was a big disaster. The Ministry of Education would have to collect data on the damage to schools. The Ministry of Health would have to collect data on damage to hospitals, clinics, etc. And also, they would have to gather information on the injuries. Ministry of maybe construction may have to
You're going the wrong, it's going the, whoa.
Okay, okay. Now, so each line ministries have to gather their data for their own objective. On the other hand, the local government and the national government have to have the united forms to have the integration at the national level. Now, when it comes to other disasters which may cross borders, let's take an example of a typhoon. There are so many typhoons which starts in the Philippines and travel up north to Japan. It's the same typhoon, but they may have different names in different countries according to the local, naming. In Asia, there is a so-called Asian unified name for typhoons. For example, the typhoon Yolanda, known in the Philippines, the international name is, the Asian name is Typhoon Haiyan. For us in Japanese, we count the typhoons in serial numbers on the annual basis. So the same phenomenon has different names, and that is one of the obstacles. So starting in 2001, there is a proposal from the Asian Disaster Reduction Center to have the so-called GLIDE. This is a global unique disaster identifier, so that it allows for interoperability of the data among countries, among different organizations, and this is already widely used among various international organizations, including OCHA or IFRC, etc., etc. And this is one of the ways to have sharing data efficiently. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Nishikawa. As you can see from the slide that he's just presented, a very fancy name, the GLIDE, but a very important tool that supports disaster data sharing across regions, across countries, and also at the global level. I will now hand over to the panelist that's joining us virtually, Mr. Daniel McGree, who is with the World Bank, to share his perspectives on this particular question. Mr. McGree, considering the gaps in standardized disaster risk data among international financial institutions, how can actuaries like yourself contribute to creating unified frameworks that align financial datasets with DRR goals? Sir, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you, and my apologies for not being able to be there in person. But I want to first maybe start with a bit of a disclaimer and recognizing that I'm naturally biased in my opinion of the role of actuaries when it comes to data. But what I have seen in my line of work with the World Bank, but also elsewhere, is that as actuaries, we have a very transferable skill set. And it's not to say that that makes us unique by any stretch, but it does mean that sometimes we have some methods and approaches when it comes to collecting and handling data that is can be used in various different contexts. I think also as well, there's often a perception that actuaries in themselves are considered for things like modelling, for forecasting and for estimating. What really needs to be recognised is that all of this relies on data. So every time, even when we're making an assumption in some sort of model that we're creating, you like for these assumptions to be data driven, if you will. And data in itself is a very broad term. It comes in various different forms. And I think just over time as well, there's starting to be recognition that data can be captured not just in neat data sets that might fit within an Excel file or these likes, but they can be captured in various different forms. In a disaster context, specifically, imagery is very, very important data that can be captured. It can tell you things about the extent of impacts. It can tell you things about or situations that might be occurring in real time that is information flow and data that can be captured and used for greater purposes. I think really when you're looking at trying to create a unified framework, the questions or the thought pattern that goes through my mind as an actuary is really thinking about, okay, so what data are we looking for? Because if you're creating a standard of any description, you really need to be specific about what's the most critical data that we need at this very point in time to answer the question that is being raised. And as this pertains to sort of the DRR goals in particular, the questions that can be raised can be various. The other question is, does the data that we're talking about exist already, or is it something that needs to be collected? Because I think the handling of the two situations creates very different dynamics. If the data doesn't exist, for instance, then what are the barriers in which it is to, or which exist to actually collect it? And what are the ways in which we can use things like technology to really enable that to take place? This is the kind of thought process that most actuaries think about in terms of when they're trying to work with data through an initial phase, but it's an important perspective in the context of trying to develop a unified framework in itself. If it's data that's very hard to obtain, it's very hard to then get compliance in terms of people filtering in their data into a unified framework. If it's too simplistic, then it may not be something that is readily or really achieving what it needs to in terms of answering the questions and trying to gain the insights that you need. So alignment in these parts is very difficult, but it should be recognised that there is a plethora of data that is available, but making it consistent across different financial institutions is really important as well in terms of the power and the insights that you can create from that particular aspect in itself. Circle back to the viewpoint of an actuary. It's not to say that actuaries are the only individuals or profession that are well equipped to do this. It just happens to be something that matches our skill sets that we often do in a different context in itself. I'll leave it there for now, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And as we could hear the importance of data for modeling purposes when it comes to decision-making processes from financial institutions. I will now refer the next question to Christine. Christine, how does data-driven decision-making influence your approach to long-term planning for both watershed management and disaster resilience? What steps are being taken within Credit Valley Conservation to ensure that preventive measures are informed by the latest data, and how these efforts be scaled to inform broader DRR policies? You have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Exley. Data is critical to watershed and disaster resiliency. Flood and erosion from extreme rainfall is one of the top threats facing the communities within the Credit River watershed. We have 70 years of watershed monitoring data and modeling that help to inform areas of prioritizing risk, as well as prioritizing investment in natural, green, and gray infrastructure. But as was mentioned previously, it's also critical that we learn from past events, so adaptive environmental management. We've had 12 extreme events, all exceeding infrastructure design standards, overwhelming our emergency management, public health, and social service systems. We had schools with 4 feet of flooding in less than 20 minutes with no evacuation plans. We had seniors living in tents. We had low-income families that ate contaminated food and got waterborne diseases. They inspired us to develop the risk and return investment tool as a way in which we can prioritize risk, prioritize collective investment with consideration for social vulnerable populations. The Credit River is 1,000 square kilometers with multiple regional and local communities, all responsible for flooding, multi-flood risk. The tool is unique in that it allows us to understand multi-flood risks from riverine, urban stormwater, sanitary, and groundwater risks. We look at it spatially, and then we also look at it from a damage cost perspective, and that allows us to target priority actions from a collective partnership. One of the things that's often forgotten is the risk that erosion poses. We had a near-miss event in which a rail line was eroded and passenger train carrying 1,000 passengers. That identified for us the need for emergency managers and asset managers to prioritize risks and assets and emergency planning. To answer your question about how does this roll up, I think one of the things that's important is that we create regional hubs. When we developed the risk tool, we didn't just look internally within our watershed. We actually went out nationally and collected data to help inform damage costing. I think empowering communities to do local action in the ground is important, and using visual tools like spatial tools, as well as damage costs, are different ways to connect with people.
Thank you very much, Christine. And as you can see on the slide that she's just ended her presentation with, the importance of community engagement in advancing data collection and sharing when it comes to different sectors that we engage with. The final panelist that I have a question for, Mr. Briggs. How do you see the role of data-driven decision-making in coordinating national efforts? Apologies. From an academic perspective, how do you approach the challenge of balancing preventive investments with immediate crisis management in disaster risk frameworks? How does your program prepare future leaders to use data in making long-term decisions that prioritize resilience and preventive measures over short-term responses?
All right, thank you, Exley. And thank you, everyone, for coming late on an afternoon to be interested in this. When we talk about the need for anticipatory action, and there were very good panels before this that were talking about how that not only empowers the community, it not only increases resilience, but it saves money. For every dollar invested in anticipatory action, it saves $15 in terms of disaster response. But the problem is that that takes political will. It takes political imagination. Our program, which consists of some very talented and experienced students, short of them getting elected to Congress and promoted to the cabinet, we have to be able to explain then to political leaders what this is, what the future might be, and why we need to make investments, especially for events that haven't happened yet, or things that we don't have experience of. You know, we do provide tools in terms of providing, how do you do risk assessment? How do you deal with financial models, whether it's a risk-cost-benefit analysis, but not just looking for the technical answer. How is that then communicated to the policymakers, to the decision makers who might just want to fall back on what they know, what's already experienced? And they'll say, well, this is the safe answer. Maybe your data aren't certain enough. And we have this prejudice where we don't make decisions unless we're sure that we have data, right? That we want to get rid of uncertainty. But uncertainty needs to be dealt with. And so part of the program, part of what we need to train people to do is how to deal with uncertainty, how to deal with these data gaps, how to know what the limitations of models are, but not to be paralyzed by that. Instead, to know, yes, we still need to make decisions, even when we don't have full information. We need to be able to come up with early warning. We need to work outside of the formal models sometimes. Oftentimes, we fall into this situation where let's trust the experts. Let's trust the formalized experts and the top scientists. And then we not we end up not listening to the local communities. We end up not listening to the indigenous knowledge, the people who can give us some sort of early warning at times. And we saw this here in the Philippines in July, right? We had Tropical Storm Karina, which didn't even make landfall, but yet because of unique combinations of sea surface temperature in the South China Sea, it ended up with historically bad floods here in the National Capital Region, elsewhere in Luzon. And the frustration that we feel from why weren't we warned? But we were relying upon older models. And we need more imagination. We need to look at scenario planning. We need to look at how to tackle uncertainty in order to not just do effective crisis management, but be able to plan ahead to things that may be unique to us and that we then need to find new capabilities to respond to.
Thank you very much, Chad. As we can hear from his intervention, the importance of training current and future leaders to deal with the issue of uncertainty when it comes to data, but also the importance of ensuring that traditional and indigenous knowledge is taken into account when we engage with data collection and sharing. Ladies and gentlemen, I will now ask the panel members a final round of questions before I open up the floor for any questions or comments from the audience. I will again start with Vidushi. Ms. Yana, how do you see the role of data-driven decision-making in coordinating national efforts, particularly in terms of preventive investments? How do you ensure that data-informed strategies for both disaster preparedness and recovery at local and national levels?
Yeah, thank you. So really important that some earlier points that were made is that we need to actually work with the government to actually explain why this data is different. So for us, I think it's relevant for each country. The level of maturity of data is very different between national, state, and local and provinces and whatever arrangements you might have. It is so important that we understand at the national level where the risks are through data. So for example, for us, there have been certain communities in Australia, Eastern Coast in particular, that have been flooded a number of times, 4 or 5 times. One of the things we are doing in Australia is to actually partner with our insurance companies to actually understand and partner with them to see where those risks are and how we can actually mitigate them so that we can actually prepare with the community, advise them of the risks, and also put some downwards pressure on the premiums with having this data. So that's going to take some time. We are working with them to actually collect that data. And it's going to require a lot of consultation in terms of understanding where those risks are for the community. The reason it's important is because we've got limited financial resources and there's only limited areas and targeting that we can do. So we obviously need the help of industry, states, territories, and at all levels to actually come up with those sort of strategies. So we are trying to build a bit of a database to see what that might look like. The other thing we're doing is we're also looking at some catchment areas. What's the overflow? What's the impact on them? What could be the impact of them? So that we can prevent that. It also helps if we have data in advance of knowing when a disaster is about to hit. So, all of you have your bureaus of meteorology. We work with them really, really closely to actually understand what might be the issues so that we can actually preempt some of the help, the financial help that might be available to a particular council or a state and territory. So those are a couple of things that we are doing. Of course, gathering that data and putting, if once you have that risk lens, that's also going to add some risk to the people and the households and the community. So that is something that we're extremely conscious of. So once you collect data, obviously using it properly is also really important because people might get alarmed if their particular houses are in a particular catchment or not a catchment, if they're in a particular area of high risk. So that's something that we need to remain conscious of. But mitigating strategies are important for us to be able to explain to government so that in the future, those limited resources can be properly invested in areas that require mitigation strategies. So we've got some funds that we look at monitoring And then then in the next round, we try to actually address some of the issues that we face in the current round or the information that we've gathered over a period of time.
Thank you very much, Ms. Yana. Two key points that I could draw out: the importance of genuine and durable partnerships. In that context, in Australia, the role of insurance and risk pooling initiatives, also the importance of decisive leadership at all levels of governance remains critical to effectively address DRR priorities. I will now move on to Professor Nishikawa. Given your current academic role and extensive government experience, how do you see the potential of disaster risk data to shape long-term national and international policies? What steps are being taken, particularly in Japan, to ensure that data-driven preventive measures are prioritized within DRR frameworks, and how can this be expanded globally? And maybe focus it on the Asia-Pacific region. Professor, you have 3 minutes.
First, let me speak about this slide. When there's a big disaster, what happens? The mass media and also the politicians would shout, do something. And if the National Disaster Management Authority or the Public Works Department are lucky, their budget would be increased for a while. Now, if these, I'll say, works, the efforts are successful, and what happens? There would be less disasters, and there would be peaceful years. Then what happens? Because the investment for disaster risk reduction does not produce immediate cash, then sometimes the politicians would start questioning, why are you using that money for something that does not produce immediate cash? Then also, when there are peaceful years, the mass media would never report about successes of disaster risk reduction. It's very ironic. Then what happens? The budget for disaster risk reduction might be decreased. Right after major disaster, there will be voluntary donations as well, but they will fade out maybe in 1 year or maximum 2 years. So the question is, how can we sustain the disaster risk reduction efforts at national and local levels? And this is the biggest challenge. The sustainability of disaster risk reduction is always the biggest challenge for any, I would say, government officer. And then what do we have to do? We have to negotiate with the Minister of Finance and also convince the political leaders about the necessity of the disaster preventive budgets. Then to do that, you always ask to be fined to, you have to show to the Minister of Finance, this is the benefit per cost of disaster risk reduction. To do that, you need the basic disaster statistics. In Japan, we have a long record of record-taking all the disasters and try to identify what are the direct loss, what are the indirect loss. And we have the so-called National White Paper on disaster risk reduction, which has been accumulated for now more than 60 years. And this serves as the basis of the basics for negotiating with the Minister of Finance and also to convince the general public and the politicians. So I would say the sustainability of disaster risk reduction depends on the sustainability of data collection and accurate collection, which can be analyzed to justify investment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for that. I will now offer the next question to our panelist who is joining online. Daniel, the next question to you is, how can national governments and IFIs collaborate to improve the collection and standardization of disaster risk data, ensuring that the data is actionable and supports both short-term decision-making and long-term resilience strategies? Over to you, Daniel.
Thank you for the question. So yes, collaboration is the key word there that is going to be consistent throughout any part of my response. But the way I see it is collaboration will only really be effective if you have the right types of experts on both sides of the coin there, as you mentioned, in terms of from the national government side, but also from the international financial institution side. So from each standpoint, they need to have a very good, relevant understanding of what data they may have themselves, but also the ability to listen and to understand and to absorb what others are trying to communicate across to them when they are talking about what data they may be able to provide, and how you can potentially unify what you have available or validate what you may have available with another data source. But these are the sorts of areas that you see data experts in particular working with, but you then also need to take a step back, I would argue, and say that you also need to have other stakeholders involved in this collaboration process. I know firsthand from direct experience that working with others who aren't necessarily as close to the data has helped me gain perspective on different points of view in terms of information that may be available and may be complementing what I see in my direct line of vision. So I think that these are key areas that can be developed further, both from a national government standpoint, but also from an international financial institution standpoint, each of which have respective capabilities and resources available to them to capture data, but also ways in which they can work closer together would be looking towards creating a common data standards, for instance, as mentioned earlier, enabling greater data sharing between relevant parties and recognising sensitivity around certain data, but also recognising that if there are issues around, say, data privacy, there are also enablers that can help you to overcome that, whether it's anonymising data, aggregating data, these sorts of things that can help you to overcome these sorts of things. The other aspect, I would argue, is to just really help people to fully understand what may be available on each side, and recognising that data doesn't always come in the neat package that you would expect it to. It can be scattered across different places, and people may not recognise what they have available to them. So being very good communicators to help people to fully understand and to collaborate a little bit more closely so that they can more truly understand the full picture when it comes to disaster risk in itself.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I will now refer the next question to Christine. As someone deeply involved in both watershed risk management and disaster resilience, how do you balance the environmental priorities with broader disaster risk reduction efforts? What role does data play in supporting the balance, particularly in ensuring that investments in environmental resilience contribute to reducing disaster risks?
Great question. Taking a watershed approach allows you to optimize both environmental and disaster resiliency. The Credit River Conservation Authority is a watershed-based jurisdiction authority. We manage floodplain management, regulation, as well as flood forecasting and warning. We're located in Ontario, Canada, between Toronto, Canada, and Buffalo, United States. Urbanization within the Credit River has gone from the lake upwards towards the headwaters, and unfortunately 70% of the urban area was built prior to flood control. And as we continue to grow up the headwaters, we increase the risk downstream to those urban areas, necessitating a watershed approach to reduce risk downstream. Our approach is to take a watershed-based scale, 3 different scales. We first look at the watershed, where we identify both the built and natural environment. Where are we seeing degradation? Where do we need to prioritize? We then do modeling at a sub-watershed level scale, where we look at different land use and climate change scenarios to understand our risk and to prioritize investment in natural, green, and gray infrastructure. And then we go down to the neighborhood scale and work with the community to do in-the-ground action with either green, gray, or natural infrastructure. To do that, we need to understand the demographics. We need to understand the social vulnerabilities. We overlay that in all of the risk mapping that we do to understand and inform actions. We also need to understand where we have the highest velocities, highest depths of flows, to inform where we need to restrict land use planning, where we need to acquire land and convert it to parkland. And we also look at pathogens, because one of the things that we need to look at is where do we prioritize public health and social services. Those priority maps then inform where we target natural, green, and gray infrastructure, and we look at various financial metrics to make the case for business for environmental and disaster resiliency. One of the takeaway messages in this slide is that if municipalities take a siloed approach and only look at their particular role and responsibility in flooding, and they don't take a watershed approach, they only found a 3% disaster or damage reduction. But if we take a collective approach, and if we look at multi-flooding and erosion, and we take a natural green and gray infrastructure approach, we found in this particular subwatershed that we could achieve a 35% average annualized damage reduction. So one of the things that I think is important when talking and galvanizing political leaders, financial and development industry, is to use spatial and financial tools to help them understand legal and reputational risk, as well as make the business case for natural, green, and gray infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christine. That's very comprehensive. Before I open the floor for any questions or comments, ladies and gentlemen, we have a final question that I would offer to Mr. Briggs. Given your academic background and experience, how do you integrate data-driven approaches into both the theoretical and practical aspects of crisis management? What do you see as the most significant opportunities for improving disaster risk data utilization in both academic settings and on-the-ground crisis management?
Thank you, Exley. Of course, it's easier to do the research and to write about something academically than to actually put it into practice. I'm very glad that the work that we started in the 1990s looking at vulnerabilities in complex systems has actually been put into practice in places like the Credit River Basin. And it's really difficult, though, in crisis situations. I've spent much of my career in conflict and post-conflict zones where either you don't have enough data, you don't have any data, or you have too much data, and that's coming in all at once, and yet decisions still have to be made. What we've tried to do, and I think some of the biggest opportunities, come from full spectrum assessments. Now, these are concepts that have been brought up academically, but putting them into practice, and we've tried even in the US for the past 15 years, it's difficult. It's difficult because we're still siloed bureaucratically. We don't share information. Everyone is trained in their own specialty, and we don't always speak the same language or share data in a way that is transferable from office to office or from country to country. But we have been able to do this in terms of crisis management and disaster intelligence. So disaster intelligence, and I've mentioned a bit on the strategic end, where we have more imagination to look into the future and see what new combinations of risks there may be. But we can also do this at the operational level. Traditionally, disaster intelligence has meant simply knowing how many hospital beds are available, how many police are available to go to one place or another. But we can increase it to cover complex systems, to know the vulnerable populations, to know how we can translate something into different cultural, linguistic, gender aspects so that the vulnerable populations aren't left. But that requires new tools. It requires new aspects, such as perhaps machine learning, so that we're not simply flooded with information, but can actually use the data effectively in a crisis situation, under stress, so that the best decisions can be made. However, this does, and going back to what I've mentioned before about training, it requires practice. People have to go through simulations. They have to go through the sort of role-playing and war games so that they can understand, they can see the patterns, so that there isn't the decision paralysis where you say, oh my God, I can't decide right now. Or where they may trust the model too much and simply follow it without understanding how this may not apply in a particular area or how it has to be adjusted given new circumstances. But I think we have new opportunities, and if we use it properly, if we engage with communities in advance, so that it's not simply someone from a capital region applying their understanding to the provinces, but instead using that sort of local knowledge to form the models in the first place, to form our understanding. And that does require, and this is the last thing I'll say about our program, requires field research. It requires field experience. It requires actually going and spending time in those areas and not simply reducing people down to numbers. And if we can do that and come up with that broader understanding, I think we have a much better chance of responding to crises and disasters effectively. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Chad. With that, ladies and gentlemen, we have time for at least one or two questions from the floor. Please, we have microphones in the middle. If you can briefly introduce your name, country, or the agency that you represent, and who you are directing your question to. We have a gentleman from the back.
Thank you very much. My question is actually directed to the whole panel. I think when we do our planning for the future, we rely on the data that we have from the past. If I'm going to build a seawall or something like that, I look at the data that we have from the past and I can say, right, I'm going to build it to 20 feet. Which is fine. But what is happening these days is with climate change and things happening so fast, where we are seeing flooding or things like that happening more often, more intense, how relevant is the data that we have collected for me to use to build, say, a seawall in the next 10 years? Or do I have to tweak the data that we have at the moment, maybe increase it by 10% or something? And what is your guidance on that? For me to be building something which is going to last with this climate change.
Thank you very much, sir. I am now looking to the panel. The question is addressed to all of you, if anyone wants to respond to that, or do you want to take turns in? Professor?
Okay, I would point out 2 points. One is we have only about 120 years of modern meteorological observation data compared to the Earth's history. And one way is to look at the very old historical records. Some countries do have very old records. It's not in the format of meteorological observation, but if you look at the old diaries of maybe dating back to the 7th or the 8th century, there are records of hot temperature. There are records of enormous storms. It's not compatible to the meteorological observation that we have now, but we can estimate the fluctuation of the natural phenomenon. That's one possibility. The other possibility is we have modern science. We can have the probabilistic models that can, I'll say, demonstrate or show in a probabilistic way the possibilities of future disasters. But the second problem is, how does that probabilistic model can convince the political leaders? That's the big question. Thank you. I will stop here.
Thank you very much. Is there any other panelist? Professor Briggs?
And we can move beyond the probabilistic models as well. In the military, we had an exercise called net assessment, which from the outside looks like a worst case scenario. But we know scientifically, and I can use Hurricane Milton from the US last week as an example, scientists described that reached pretty much the extreme of what was possible for a storm given the circumstances, given the environmental conditions, we can actually model what are possible scenarios in the future. So working away from just the historical records where we extrapolate or trying to set a probability for something that we don't actually know what the probability is. Because when you're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about something we want to be there for 20, 40, 50 years. And in that case, sometimes we'll use scenarios where we look at how bad could it get, what are the vulnerabilities, and what's reasonable then? The problem, of course, as mentioned by my colleague, is that how do you convince the politicians? Because the other aspect, and I didn't go into it, was with Milton is, say, the disinformation. And that's one of the hardest parts of data to deal with, is when there's so much disinformation about something that it undercuts our ability to actually do rational and data-driven decision-making.
Thank you very much. I see Christine's hand is also up, but also Daniel, if you would like to also intervene, let us know. Christine?
Well, I think getting back to an earlier comment that you made about don't let uncertainty prevent you from doing what needs to be done. The definition of insanity is continuing to do the same thing over and over and getting different results. We have definitely been seeing extreme events more frequently. And one of the things that we do as part of watershed planning is look at climate scenarios. We look at different ranges, and the Canadian government does recommend for us to look at the different global scenarios to see what ranges, how will it impact, for instance, flooding. What we like to do is build resiliency, so putting in storm ponds within a parkland so that we can build the storm pond larger if we need to, given future. So again, I don't like to drive looking in the rearview mirror, and I don't think we should be designing infrastructure that way.
Thank you very much. Vidushi?
I obviously will have to rely on some science, but I can share a practical, example where we in Australia have, faced a number of disasters over the last couple of years that we haven't seen before. Flooding, repeat flooding. Our events are complex, concurrent, compounding, and consecutive. So one of the things that's happened because of those events is that the government is now looking at options and looking at risk profiles and looking to partner and looking more into data and see how we can support in the future. So I suppose that's a bit of a shift. It's taken a number of disasters to do that. But we will obviously work with the data fraternity to see how we can better protect moving forward.
Thank you. Daniel, do you want to respond as well to this question?
I think it's well answered. I'm happy to allow for more questions.
Okay. Thank you. We have another question on the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. I am Jain Aragon from the Asian Institute of Management. And maybe I'd like to start my question by quoting this, that the one who holds the data holds the power. And while I do applaud all of these strategies for data-driven decision-making, knowing the risks, the vulnerabilities, what we can do to intervene, I'm reminded on how these can also be used in the negative aspect. For example, Dr. Saturo, you mentioned that there is a need for interoperability of data, not just in the local level, but also in the international level. And I was thinking that even in the local level, there are different factions, for example, we have the Abu Sayyaf, we have the terrorism group, and imagine that also in the global scale. Now, I'm thinking that is there, for example, have we thought about the relationship of these with security and terrorism? For like as Professor Chad, our AIM extraordinaire professor, said that uncertainties have to be dealt with. And I think terrorism and data security of this level is one of those that have to be dealt with. So may I just ask for comments on those? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. Since Professor Nishikawa and Professor Briggs, your two's name were mentioned, I might offer the opportunity to you first to respond, and then Christian, Daniel, and Vitusha.
Well, I would say that it all depends on how the public accepts the importance of such data, events data, and how these accurate information can be shared and also exclude disinformation. I'll stop here. Thank you.
John, I'll give you a longer answer on Saturday in class. For the benefit of everyone else, it's true that if someone holds the information, even if it's not true information, but believable information, because so much of disaster information is storytelling. And we had reports yesterday from the United States that FEMA was pulled out of disaster areas because there was threatened violence against them, and it was because of conspiracy theories. And that was political power being used against an established and humanitarian effort. So I really think that we do need to think about how information is used, how it's disseminated, how we don't always control it. There was so much disinformation about vaccines. There's so much disinformation about what actually happens in government. And for the record, the US does not control weather. And we need to be in front of that. We can't simply wait and respond because disinformation is insidious. It breaks down trust. It breaks down our ability to respond and our ability to plan. So yeah, I thank you for the question, but I want to defer to others.
Thank you very much. I note that time is not on our side, so I might offer an opportunity to the remaining panelists if they want to provide a brief response. And then, unfortunately, I have to wrap up our session today. You have the panelists in front, so after this session, feel free to share cards and contacts so you can follow up. Is there anyone else that want to offer an additional response to that question?
The only thing I'd add is that the government obviously has a responsibility to make sure that they raise awareness and that misinformation, disinformation is an actual issue. And I think that's on every government's agenda and radar to address. And particularly during a disaster, it becomes rather important.
While I can't speak about misinformation, I think with how you communicate information, and that's again where demographics is so important and testing language that we use. Only 13% of people knew what a watershed was. 33% thought it was a shed that held water. So if we're saying protect the watershed, what does that mean?
Thank you very much, Daniel. If you can still hear us, I would like to give you an opportunity, maybe any final word from you before I wrap up?
Yeah, I'll be very brief, but to just reiterate some of the points that were mentioned around it's not just the data that you collect and how you use that data through analysis to create insights, but really the communication of that information at the end is critical to ensuring that the people that you are speaking with in terms of them having to understand any particular insights is just as important as all the groundwork that goes into it, and instances where that has been communicated, also instances where it is dramatised, if you will, or sensationalised so that it can create a headline or something that would capture the attention of people, it is detrimental to proper understanding of actual disaster risks in any kind of context. But I'll leave it there for the sake of time, and I'll just recap to say thank you everyone for taking the time to listen to us this afternoon.
All right, thank you very much, Daniel. Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately we don't have time for another question, but I would now propose to summarize some of the key themes that has come out from the reflections and perspectives from this distinguished panelist. First, the vital role of data in disaster risk reduction, particularly in balancing immediate recovery efforts with long-term preventive investments, came out very strongly. We've heard how data gaps and the lack of standardized frameworks create significant challenges in coordinating effective responses at both the national and international levels. Without reliable data, it becomes difficult to make informed decisions that optimize resources for both preparedness and recovery. Another key point that we can draw out from today's discussion is the need for collaboration across sectors and also with communities, and the important role of indigenous knowledge came out as a very strong theme that we've heard from the panelists today. And the last point before I draw this session to a close is how global data standardization is critical to ensuring that DRR strategies are cohesive and effective, not just at a national level, but across international borders. Standardizing disaster risk data will help align both policy frameworks and financial mechanisms, enabling better outcomes for communities at risk. With that, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a round of applause to our distinguished panelists for this afternoon. Thank you very much, panelists, for sharing your perspectives and contributing to an insightful discussion this evening. With that, wishing you all a safe and nice evening. Thank you very much for taking time to join us for this important session focused on data-driven decision-making for risk-informed development and financing. Have a good evening. Thank you.